There is no doubt, FRU is easier than DSR in top, quite significantly so, but is that a bad thing? And is it only the difficulty that changed since Endwalker? DSR and top broke statics and players alike. The step up from T to DSR was massive, and while top wasn't necessarily a step up, it was punishing, and its design made it especially frustrating. Is FRU the response to this? What makes FRU so much more approachable? And is the direction we are heading the right one? When UCOP first came out, the players were not prepared. It took a staggering 11 days to clear. Ever since, expectations were set for ultimate raids. UWU was fundamentally different, having a puzzle mechanic at the center, being quite easy for the majority of the fight and a lot of backloaded difficulty. As Creative Business Unit 3 found its formula for ultimate design, T was the result. Mainly front-loaded difficulty, full uptime phases mixed with trio mechanics, a puzzle mechanic somewhere in the middle, with a comparatively easy last phase. T's puzzle was particularly far back and difficult to crack, majorly impacting progression and making the design team reconsider the complexity and obscurity of puzzles. DSR and top followed this formula with their own twists. DSR confused players by having a checkpoint, which turned out to just cut off phase 1, which was mainly meant as a story introduction so the intermission could make sense. But that wasn't all. DSR was far more difficult than any of the 3 ultimates that came before it. DPS checks were somewhat tight. Sanctity was a brutal mechanic at first, and remains one if not the only mechanic that is unsolvable without knockback immunity, while also requiring precision with meteors, particularly in the cursed pattern. Top released and brought with it difficulty in different forms. All mechanics are fully random, which surprisingly makes top the most straightforward ultimate to play with a non-standard composition. It was also the introduction of exponential stack damage, where player stack mechanics would deal increased damage if taken with less people than intended. There's a lot more to be said about each ultimate, but we're here to talk about FRU, so this short recap shall suffice. The first question we have to address is whether FRU is truly easier or if players have simply evolved. A lot of time has passed since the days of Abyssos, and certainly more than between the release of DSR and top. Particularly Party Finder has found its footing for ultimate raids. I still remember the days before DSR, when T was considered an ultimate you can't do with random groups, and even UCOP and UWU were a relatively rare sight in Party Finder. Looking at the data available, the clear rates for early FRU are considerably higher, not just 10 or 20 or 30%, but a staggering 800%. This is not the players improving, as clear rates went down rather than up over the release of DSR and top. While there were developments on the side of players, such as people quickly deciding on strategies per region and adhering to them, if one looks at FRU's mechanics, it becomes clear the fight is not made easy by the players. Alright, so FRU is clearly easier than its direct predecessors, but why? Now that we established that FRU seems to be easier, given its clear rates, let's look at how its design and mechanics make it easier. The first thing that has to be mentioned is Mark of Mortality, a new debuff introduced to replace the exponential stack damage from top to force players to play stack mechanics correctly, which FRU has a very high amount of. If a stack is taken with less players than intended, surviving the damage is trivial compared to other ultimates. However, everyone will receive this new debuff, which acts as a twice-come ruin but also a 90% damage down. It is a double-edged sword, making beating a phase almost impossible due to the severity and duration of the damage debuff, but it also allowed groups to see past mechanics that would have usually killed most if not all of the party. For world-first contenders, gathering information is extremely valuable, so this considerably sped up the time to clear the fight. Next up, the fight has little body checks, particularly because of Mark of Mortality existing. Many mechanics will punish a missing player, but usually leading only to one more death, like the retarding of spreads or Proteans in P1. Take for example Diamond Dust, the first mechanic in Phase 2. It is a fast mechanic requiring quick thinking, precise positioning and movement. A little bit like Party Synergy in top. However, it is overall much easier, not only in straight up difficulty but mainly due to deaths being recoverable. Any death during Party Synergy was a guaranteed wipe and still is. Further, many situations that would be unrecoverable in top and DSR can be dealt with in FRU. The best examples lie in Phase 3. A poorly placed rewind in Ultimate Relativity can be fixed by walling yourself after having taken care of your debuffs and Hourglass. A death on Apocalypse can be fixed with a tank invulning between the water stacks. Which leads me to the next point. The tank doesn't even have to invuln, but using all their mitigation suffice. Unlike almost any other fight, even Savage or Extreme fights, the Vuln debuff in FRU seems considerably undertuned. Usually a magic Vuln means that even a magic pinprick will kill you. The most notable example here is in Phase 4, during the key mechanic of the fight, Crystalline Time. The mechanic is supposed to require strict positioning, but can be cheesed with just 30% mitigation and shields, or rampart and short cooldowns for tanks. Now that we looked at some of the specifics of how mechanics work, let's take a step back and look at the fight as a whole. Usually the first phases of ultimates are particularly difficult and punishing, to offset the fact that players will naturally practice them the most. This isn't really the case for Fatebreaker. The phase allows players to tune out for the majority of it, only requiring a brief burst of concentration when tethers go out for Fall of Faith. Losing concentration or autopiloting during Looper, Pantocrator or Sanctity can very quickly lead to wipes. This may sound like a minor and obscure thing to bring up, but Phase 1 is the phase every pull has to go through, from the very start. As a whole, there is a few mechanics where small mistakes lead to an unavoidable wipe. The main one would be Apocalypse. However, with smart play, a large portion can be recovered. There simply aren't many stones to stumble over. Let's compare the penultimate phases of the last 3 ultimates. DSR Phase 6 and Top Phase 5, both incredibly punishing. While FRU P4 has Darklit Dragonsong, a mechanic that can absolutely be done correctly by the entire group the first time it is encountered, very much unlike Run Dynamis Delta or Sigma. The follow-up mechanic Crystalline Time is in fact the big challenge of this ultimate, but that is almost the only wall that prevents a group from reaching the final phase. Speaking of final phases, FRU's last phase is arguably on par or even easier than DSR's final phase. But not in its release state, but the current state, with all the dungeon gear, sync down gear and better consumables we have. One last thing that made prog of FRU smoother, a lack of major bugs. DSR had tower spawning in Africa during Phase 3. Top had the infamous Phase 3 and Phase 5 auto attack bugs. Hard to see cones in the intermissions are hardly comparable. So good job Square Enix on that one. The question that we have to ask now is FRU's more forgiving design and lack of backloaded difficulty a bad thing or a step in the right direction? When progressing the fight, I heard a lot of opinions on it. Overall, the mood I encountered was rather positive. Many seem to enjoy the fight, not heavily punishing every minor mistake in comparison to Top and DSR. While you can argue that easier difficulty means the ultimate lasts for a shorter amount of time, many see it as a higher quality time than being stuck for days on mechanics like party synergy or having consistency issues. For this section of the video I intended to present arguments for both sides, the ones arguing it is a step in the right direction as well as those finding it too easy, but actually got stuck for a while, hence the delay. I was unable to find many opinions against the lower difficulty, and while I can think of some arguments of my own, they wouldn't be born out of my own genuine opinion. Thankfully, having a discussion on the Balance Discord, I did eventually solve this mystery. Many of the players that are publicly outspoken are also those that tend to spend time in Party Finder. A lot of the opinions I heard came from LPDU and friends I made over the years in my stream or when playing in Party Finder. Naturally, this ultimate lends itself very well to random groups, much more so than DSR or Top. While I doubt that was the intention of the developers, it makes sense that players that attempt to tackle this fight with pickup groups have a positive outlook on it, and those that keep to their statics with a little public presence aren't hurt as much. But there is definitely a different side to this coin. Ultimates are meant as the pinnacle of difficulty. They aren't designed to be played by the majority, not even the majority of players that clear the Savage tier. Their reason for existing is for the most dedicated players to have something to sink their teeth into and to be a spectacle for outside observers and the players that play them. And FRU does not do this job nearly as well as Top and DSR. That doesn't mean either side is wrong. As you might be used to from my channel, I want to view this discussion from varying angles that all have their own merit, without judging either side. While overall I am more focused on the fight being fun than super difficult, The lower difficulty has lessened the achievement of conquering the fight at least somewhat for me personally. Additionally, its ability to be played with ease in Party Finder has had profound impacts on my static as well as other statics that I observed. In DSR on top, it felt impossible to match the progress you would make in a static, even a moderately skilled one, in Party Finder. But for FRU it's sort of the reverse, where static almost feels more like a hindrance than a boon. The cohesion and teamwork that would make these fights possible doesn't seem as much required in FRU, with mitigation and healing checks far more relaxed, allowing skilled players to beat them without requiring a lot of cooperation. This mirrors similar developments we have seen for the Savage tier, but while I welcome them for Savage, making it more approachable and closing the major gap we discussed in the last video between Savage, Extreme and normal difficulty content, for Ultimate it is a different story. I purposefully left this topic out until now, because it feels somewhat unrelated from the quality of the Ultimate. But at the end, the balance of jobs has a major impact on the experience players have with the fight, and unfortunately, Pictomancer has had a majorly negative impact on FRU, so we have to talk about it. Not only are there direct effects we see, like players locking their caster spot to Pictomancer, but also the inability for the developers to design the damage checks of the fight in a fair way. They feel rather trivial for modern Ultimate, with a Pictomancer in the party, but not so much with any other caster. If they made the checks harder, demand for Pictomancer would be even higher. The issue here isn't purely with numbers. Square Enix has purposefully not nerfed Pictomancer and instead opted to buff other jobs, a strategy well established in gaming in general. However, while in other content the gap isn't that high, Picto scales incredibly well with downtime, where they can paint the motifs, which for those unaware are long 4-second casts that by themselves deal no damage. These casts usually offset their otherwise high damage, but with downtime they can shift those casts into phases where attacking the boss isn't possible anyway, and don't suffer from not attacking the boss for several long seconds while they paint. I do not see a way for the developers to fix Pictomancer without making it underperform in other content and still overperform in Ultimates without addressing this fundamental issue. They could make motives faster to cast at the cost of lower potency, but finding moments in a fight where you can stand still for 4 seconds is part of Pictomancer's appeal. Another approach would be to shift damage into their basic and subtractive combo and away from the motives. This would also help bring their burst in line and making other range jobs more attractive for buff-heavy teams. Just to give a perspective here, as Astrologian, I want to give the target with the best burst damage my 2 cards, the Balance and the Spear. The Spear is for ranged jobs, and there is no job that comes remotely close to Pictomancer, to such an extreme degree that even a Pictomancer with weakness is a better card target than other ranged jobs. FRU goes in the right direction with some of its changes, granting ways to smartly recover a pull, damage checks that aren't overly tight even without Pictomancer, especially in phases with difficult mechanics. However, it also overcompensates for the difficulty of DSR on top, being overall too easy and letting players zombie through phases for far too long. My hope for the next Ultimate is a difficulty between FRU and the Endwalker Ultimates, with mechanics and phases that apply the lessons learned from the last 3 Ultimates. It will be interesting to see how FRU develops as dungeon gear and better consumables become available. If it elevates the fight like DSR, which became a lot more enjoyable for many that way, or if it ends up pushing its difficulty down too much and it ends up in a situation like UCOP, where deaths are almost meaningless and the most important thing is having a red mage to raise.